Hey, Twisted listeners, I'm Cindy, and this is Twisted Listers, a podcast about murder and lists. And this is the second episode where I'm flying solo, and I chose a topic inspired by some topical news. I'm sure you all have heard about the Titan Submersible that imploded with a bunch of billionaires inside this week. In fact, today is the day that they really finally determined what had happened. And I've been following this very closely because I found it really interesting and just like completely fucking bizarre. And it inspired me to do another case that has to do with the ocean. And I just want to say really quickly that if anybody has an issue with people finding this story kind of, I don't know, amusing, there's all this weird like moral kind of outrage about people making light of the deaths of these men, but you just have to remember that billionaires are not made from their own hard work. They're made from the suffering and often deaths of many, many people below them while they hoard wealth so they can spend $250,000 going in a tin can to the bottom of the ocean. So I'm just going to leave that there. But I think you all know my thoughts. Anyway, the story that I'm doing today, I am going to call the Bluebelle and the Sea Orphan. And you'll understand why as we get into it. So I'm going to start in November 1961. Oh, I guess before I do that, rate, review, follow us on Instagram, join us on Patreon. We don't put out a ton of stuff on Patreon, but a great way to support a small podcast that puts out 2 episodes a week is to just give us $1 a month. It costs only $1 for you, and it makes a huge difference for us. You do get access to a lot of extra content. We just don't post that much because two a week is a lot. So if you guys would like to do that, everything is linked on our website and on our Instagram page. Ratings are great, reviews are great, everything's appreciated. All right, back to the case of the Bluebelle and the Sea Orphan. All right, November 13th, 1961, the Gulf Lion oil rig was out at sea on its way to Puerto Rico when a lookout on board saw a dinghy floating in the sea. As they got closer to this dinghy, they realized there was a person on it, and this person ended up being 44-year-old boat skipper Julian Harvey, who had been waving his hands vigorously trying to get the rig's attention. When they pulled Julian to safety, they realized he was not alone and that he had with him the body of a small child who was later identified as 7-year-old Renee Duperrault. Julian said that he had been the skipper on a ketch, which is a 2-masted sailboat, which has a lower deck for sleeping. The ketch had hit rough waters the night before and ended up sinking into the ocean after a fire broke out on deck. And according to Julian, everyone on board but himself had been lost at sea. He said that he had grabbed Renee's body out of the water so that she could be buried by her remaining family, as the rest of her immediate family had perished in the accident, as had Julian's wife, Mary. The family who died consisted of 40-year-old Arthur Duperrault, his wife Jean Duperrault, who was 38, their 14-year-old son Brian Duperrault, their 7-year-old daughter Renee Duperrault, who was with Julian, and 11-year-old Terry Jo Duperrault. Like I said, Julian's wife Mary Harvey also perished. Within just a couple of days, Julian, he was taken to the hospital, but he was released within just a few days and was back in Miami, which is where the boat had set sail just a week prior. Police were still investigating the accident since, so many people had died, but Julian was free to kind of go back to work almost immediately and seemed okay to do so, which is a little crazy to think. He was very likely just in shock to be able to kind of function the way that he was. So they're, looking into it. But, within just a few days, he's just like free and kind of out doing his thing. Then on November 16th, a Greek freighter, either called or manned by Captain Theo, was out on the northwest Providence Channel, which is near the Bahamas, so not super far from Florida, when someone on board saw something floating in the water. As they approached this tiny vessel, they realized there was someone on board, and that someone was weakly waving to them for help. Second Officer Nikolaos Spakidakis was the first to see this person, who was clearly a young girl, and helped rescue her by hoisting her into the boat. This girl was terribly sunburnt, dehydrated, and had been without food and water for what they could tell were days, but was still able to identify herself as 11-year-old Terry Jo Duperrault. Terry was then given water, orange juice. She had Vaseline applied to her lips by the crew. She fell into unconsciousness. They tucked her into bed and they called for help. When she awoke, she was in a hospital in Florida. The men who found her remember she was nearly impossible to see as she was dressed in all white, including her life vest and the cover on the vessel she was on, so she looked like the white cap of a wave. So it was really, really hard to see her. And side note, this later is what led to life jackets having to be orange. Like this story is what led to that change, and they are like now required to be bright orange and definitely not white because you can't see them. Within 3 hours of her admission to the hospital, Terry Jo began to show signs of recovery, though it took many more days for her to really be able to like fully communicate and for her to be considered no longer in critical condition. The same day that she was found, Julian Harvey, the skipper, was called in to retell his story of how the boat went under. And again, he, retold the story. It had been hit by rough waters. He said that at around 11 p.m., a powerful gust snapped the mainmast in two. A 50-foot length came hurtling down, piercing the deck and rupturing the fuel lines on the boat, which burst into flame. While Harvey was fighting the blaze with extinguishers, his wife and their 5 passengers retreated to the stern. By then, however, the ketch was down. While the others leapt into the water, Harvey launched the dinghy, dove overboard, hauled himself into the lifeboat, and made a desperate effort to find Mary and the Duperraults, shouting himself hoarse in the darkness. Unfortunately, no one heard his cries, and at last he came upon Renee's body floating face down in the water, with a life jacket on, but still drowned. He hauled her onto the dinghy and decided to keep her with him, again, so that her family, her extended family, would have somebody to bury, as the others had all been lost at sea. Police were skeptical, mostly due to his having all sorts of survival supplies on the dinghy, which would suggest that he had time to pack. But it was found that Renee had in fact drowned, and without anybody else to say otherwise, police were like, that must have been what happened. And also, like, dinghies can sometimes be packed with supplies, so it was kind of a reach for them to kind of think that might mean something, Any case, he came off as a bit arrogant, not super upset about his wife's death or the tragedy in general. Like, that's a hugely traumatic thing. And to be fair, people do grieve in different ways. So he could have been completely numb, like he could have been processing it by not processing it, essentially. However, just as he was finishing his story, news came in that Terry Jo had been found. And when he heard this, Julian, who, like I said, had been like the picture of composure to this point, exclaimed, "Oh my God," and then very quietly added, "Isn't that wonderful?" Julian then said that he was tired and wanted to go home and that he could resume this interview the following day. Police were like, "Yeah, absolutely. You've been through a lot. Feel free to go home. We'll check in with you in a day or two." Julian then went and checked himself into a motel room under the name John Monroe. He paid cash for the room, and sometime in the next 24 hours, he wrote a 2-page suicide note, then killed himself by slashing his thighs, wrists, and jugular with a razor. He was later found by a maid. When police arrived at the motel, they at first thought Julian had been murdered because the attack was so vicious. They were like, there's no way somebody did this to themselves. But after finding and authenticating the suicide note, which he had written to an old buddy from World War II because he was in the Army or the Navy, probably the Navy, in World War II, they realized that he had, in fact, killed himself in that manner, which is crazy because it was like super over the top violent, which isn't by and large the way that people kill themselves. So, kind of interesting. Anyway, let's get back to Terry. Within 5 days of being found on this dinghy, which by the way was a corkboard dinghy that was basically like mesh underneath and like floating, it had like a floating kind of thing around the edges. So it was like almost like an inner tube, but it had like mesh that you kind of sat in. So after being in that for or after 5 days, she was able to recount exactly what had happened to her that night while aboard the Bluebelle. So she was finally kind of waking up. She's 11 years old. She's going to recover much more quickly than like a full-grown adult, obviously. So she was back talking, remembered everything, and had a lot to say. But before we get to that, I'm going to go ahead and tell you all about how she and her family ended up on this boat with this skipper. Terry Jo Duperrault was born and raised in Wisconsin by her father, Arthur, and mother, Jean. She had 2 siblings, like I said, an older brother, Brian, and a younger sister, Renee. The family was very close and they had a really great life. Arthur had been in the Navy during World War II, and despite having also been born and raised in Wisconsin, developed a love for the sea during this time. He became a very well-respected optometrist after his time in the Navy and had a very successful practice in Wisconsin. Jean, as far as I know, didn't have to work, so she was able to just focus on raising the 3 children, which is great. As the kids got older, Arthur and Jean dreamed of going on a long family vacation, first to the Bahamas, and then also taking a trip around the world all on a boat. They wanted to spend the winter in the sun instead of in the cold, snowy Wisconsin, which they had done like some like cold ice boating, I guess, or something having to do with like lakes, but it's always very cold there. So they were kind of finally wanting to do something in the warmth and in the sun and something tropical. They saved their money for years to make this happen. I mean, he had a really good practice going, but it also costs a lot to do something like that. So they saved and saved and saved. And finally, in 1961, their dream became a reality. And then a nightmare. Arthur took a long leave of absence from his job, checked the kids out of school, and off they went to Florida to find a boat. The first plan was to buy one and sail it themselves with Arthur, using his Navy training. But for whatever reason, very unfortunately, that didn't work out, so they had to charter one instead. Now, I don't know if buying the boat would have made this any different, but once they decided they had to charter one, they asked one of Arthur's old friends, more like old acquaintances, Julian Harvey, to be the skipper, and for his wife to be the cook for the expedition. So they would pay them both to join them on this trip, first to the Bahamas and then to like around the world. So the trip to the Bahamas was going to be like 5 to 7 days. They would come back, kind of regroup, and then potentially take off and be gone, just see how long it takes. So the family set sail at night on November 8th, and this was at Julian's urging, and nobody to this day really knows why, but apparently he said it was a better idea to get a jump at night. They'd get through the water faster. I don't know. But anyway, that's what they did. They left at like 11 o'clock on November 8th, and things went mostly well. Mary was sweet. Julian was an old friend. So, the trip was fun. It was exciting for the family. I know that they ended up on some island in the Bahamas and they fell in love with it. They were like, we're going to build a vacation home here. Maybe we'll retire here. But they were definitely like going to come back. So they did spend some time on the island, but as far as I know, they always slept on the boat. And part of this was Julian's like urging to keep them on the boat. It may have been, because if they're going to travel around the world, they're going to have to sleep on the boat. So they might as well do it as part of the trial run. But anyway, they were super having a great time. Everybody was having fun, stopping at islands, sailing all day, just having a great time. So now we're up to November 12th. It's, the 5th day of the trip, and it's evening, and they're kind of on their way back, I think, towards Florida, but they're still pretty close to the Bahamas. Now, Terry recalls on this night going below deck to sleep in the cabin for the night. And around 11 p.m., she's awakened by terrible screaming. The screaming was from her older brother Brian, who I will remind you was 14. And what he was screaming was, "Help me, daddy." And I just want to pause for a second here because it really struck me and really made me sad that a 14-year-old would call his father daddy. And to me, I mean, maybe he did always, but I kind of think at 14, you're probably not doing that anymore. So to me, that's a show of how scared and desperate he was in that moment, which truly breaks my heart. So at first, Terry was frozen with fear and said as she stayed in her bed, she heard thumping and stomping sounds and just lots of loud noises above deck. Finally, she gets up the courage to make her way up to the top of the deck to see what's going on, and the first thing she sees is her mother and brother on the ground covered in blood. She later said she knew they were dead and kind of fell into a sort of shock. And she has no idea what's going on, right? She doesn't know if pirates boarded the ship, if somebody fell over. She has no idea. She also said that she then saw Julian, and when she saw him, he was on deck, and I think she had said that he had a gun in his hand, and he pushed her back down into the cabin, telling her, get back down there, get down there. And so she's thinking some attack is happening. So she goes into hiding underneath, in the, in her bed or whatever, below deck. She trusted him. Then she's laying in the bed, freaking out, wondering what's going on. And suddenly the cabin starts to fill with water, but not just water, with an oily, really smelly substance. This was gas. So gas was now filling up the cabin that she's in, water and gas. So the boat is sinking and there's gas leaking everywhere. So now she comes back up again and Julian hands her a rope attached to a dinghy. And he's like, "Hold on to this." And he pointed the gun at her for a second, she said, but then he took it off of her and was like, hold this rope for me." So she's holding this rope. The boat is clearly sinking. She had no idea where her father was. She didn't know where her sister was. The only time she saw her mother and brother, they were clearly dead on the ground. And she's 11 years old. So she lets go of the rope because she's completely in fucking shock. Julian sees her drop this rope and jumps overboard to get onto the dinghy. And it was at this point that Terry Joe realized he was not coming back for her. He was not trying to save her. And he was not trying to save anybody else on that boat. He left her to die. Now, very luckily, Terry Joe's father had showed her another smaller cork dinghy on the back of the boat. And she ran for that, unhooked it from the main boat, threw it over, and jumped onto it. Now, she also had a life vest on, a white one, like we had said. So she was able to kind of get her shit together a little bit here and jump off of the boat. And she sailed on this tiny cork, whatever the fuck it was, for 4 days. It was just under 4 days. It was 84 hours or something insane. Now, this cork dinghy is meant to last for 4 or 5 hours. It's a really short-term solution. So it's falling apart underneath her as she's floating through the waters. And there are sharks in this ocean. And she has no food, no water. The life jacket and size of the dinghy made it so that she could not lay down. And she's dressed in a white shirt, a white life jacket, and light colored pants. So she's completely, you can't see her. She's blonde. She said that she saw rescue planes flying overhead and would wave for them, but nobody could see her. So she's just getting sunburnt, dehydrated, no food, just sitting in the water for 4 days. But this little girl survives. And she actually later went on to say that she felt like there was a reason that she survived. I don't really know exactly what that reason was, but I think it was to tell the story of her family. And I think that's, how do you survive that? How does an 11-year-old survive 4 days without water in the blazing sun in the middle of the ocean without getting eaten by a shark or having something else happen? And how does that dinghy miraculously last this long, right? Totally fucking crazy. So now they have all of this information from Terry Joe. They have Julian Harvey killing himself. And they're like, holy shit, this guy went crazy and murdered a whole family. Now, as it turns out, he actually stabbed the family to death after drowning his wife. And he didn't stab Renee to death. I think he just let her drown on the boat because she's 7 years old. She's not going to be able to save herself. So, or he maybe held her under. I don't know. But in any case, he left Terry there to die. And it was a good thing that he did that because obviously that did not work in his favor. And he, well, I mean, paid the ultimate price, I guess. So now police know what happened, but they don't know why. And they started doing some digging and they found some really interesting things about this guy, Julian. Now, like I said, just like Arthur, he had served in World War II. And as far as we know, he'd had like a pretty uneventful tour of duty. But you know, that shit can affect people different ways. And after doing more digging into Julian Harvey's background, police found that after he finished his tours of duty, in the Army or the Air Force, he had a really hard time holding down a job and was constantly in dire straits financially. He just had a lot of issues with money. They also found that he had previously survived a 1949 car accident that had killed the second of his previous 5 wives and her mother. And he plunged off a bridge at high speed into a bayou. And he had swum to safety while his wife Joan and her mother Myrtle both drowned. I believe that he had insurance on both of them. Plus, he got insurance just for the car and for the, injuries and all that. He also had some other instances of insurance fraud. He had a yawl, which is a boat called the Torbatros, that had previously sunk after running into submerged wreckage of a warship. He apparently had basically intentionally driven the boat into the wreckage, knowing it was there, despite his crew telling him not to, so that he could get the insurance money for his damaged boat. He also had a power boat that sunk under suspicious circumstances in the coast of Cuba. All of these had large insurance payouts. So this guy has a thing for insurance fraud. So that is a really bad sign. As they look more into this motherfucker, they realize that about 2 months before this quote unquote, accident, or what he was planning to call an accident, Harvey had taken out a double indemnity insurance policy against his wife, who he had just recently married. They married in July 1961, and this accident happened in November. So it's pretty clear that he married her to kill her for insurance money. So he's upping the ante, right? He's like starting with well, no, I guess not, because he killed his wife and his second wife and her mother. So I guess he's just ping-ponging around with various types of insurance fraud. So just a few months before this, before he murdered all of these people, he had been hired for $300 a month and free accommodation on this ship. So he was allowed to live on the ship and given $300 a month to start taking tourists around on this boat. So he didn't even own this boat. It was owned by somebody else. And it just turned out that he and Arthur knew each other. So it was like this weirdly horrible connection, right? So police begin to think that Julian formulated this plan to kill Mary, his wife, and throw her overboard and then say that she must have fallen and disappeared and collect the life insurance. And what they assumed happened is that he wanted to do it when they had tourists on the boat, because the tourists would be like, yeah, we were with him, we didn't see anything, it was just an accident, whatever. But what probably happened is that Arthur caught him in the act. Or maybe Brian did, but one of the family members. And as a result, he attacked and murdered all of them. And then he, sank the boat, tried to set fire to it, and left Terry Jo. And they don't believe that he left Terry Jo on purpose. They believe that he just figured she would drown, just like Renee, but she didn't, amazingly. So this guy has just a really long history of insurance fraud and also, murder. And when he finally got caught, he took the easy way out. And I have to say that the really fucking irritating thing is that in his suicide note, which was 2 whole pages, he did not acknowledge this situation at all. He had just killed a little girl's entire fucking family, and his 5th wife, So he killed 2 out of 5 wives, which is pretty fucking crazy. He just said like, oh, I'm tired. I can't go on like this anymore. Basically boo-hoo, victim bullshit. And then killed himself, which is super fucking crazy to me. Like, I feel like his time spent in the war, like, fucked him up. And he never recovered. Because it doesn't seem like he had any sort of, history of this before going in and serving. So I just really wonder, what the effects of that were. And I don't want to like give this guy too much credit, he might have just been a piece of shit. So in any case, after she is kind of recuperated, Terry Jo returns to Green Bay, and she lives with her aunt, her grandmother, and 3 cousins. And she refused to part with the blouse and slacks that she was wearing when she was rescued. She wanted to hold on to those. That was kind of like what she needed maybe to mourn her family. The next year, she changed her name to T-E-R-E. It had been T-E-R-R-I. I think she was trying to not look like a victim. And what she also did or didn't do was talk about the trauma for years and years and years, because it wasn't considered something that you really do. Like, you shouldn't talk about your trauma. It's the 60s. Like, nobody really knows about, therapy. It's not really, it was a thing, but it was not like a widespread thing like it is now. So it took her a very long time to ever talk about this. I think the first time that she did an interview in like the early 2000s. And in 2010, she wrote a book with a psychologist, and it's called Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean. And it's really fucking crazy. It details everything about what happened. It talks about her life. It's really interesting. I didn't read the whole thing, but I read some excerpts, and it's fascinating. It's really, really fascinating. So yeah, she married, she had children. She always wanted to live and work near the ocean, which I think is also like a weird trauma response. But more power to her, whatever she needs, you know what I mean? And she finally did some interviews when she got older. And then I actually realized what she said. She thought that she was saved for a reason, because if her story can help someone else heal from tragedy, then her journey was worth it. So that's the story. It's a crazy ass story of murder on the open sea. Really fucking sad. This family, like, dreamed of this, saved for it, worked for it, and finally made it happen. And then some piece of shit just took it from them for money. So pretty shitty. But I wanted to cover this because, 1, it's a crazy ass tale. And 2, there's been some ocean news lately. So I kind of wanted to piggyback off that. Although I think this story is a lot sadder, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, guys, we'll be back next week with Diva, and we're going to do people, 4th of July murders, we'll say. We're doing murders on the 4th of July. And y'all will be surprised to know there's some fucking mass shootings up in there, because America. Nobody likes to celebrate America more than mass shooters, apparently. And nothing says America more than a mass shooting. So, anyway, thanks again, everybody, for listening. Please like, rate, review, tell your friends and family. And until next week, stay off our lists.